Oakglen. I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years, I used living history in the classroom to bring the subject to life for my students. And I'm not in the classroom anymore, which means I get to use all the garb I have at home and the passion for bringing the past to life to dig deep into subjects that I didn't normally get to cover in class due to restrictions of the curriculum. So what I've been doing since I retired is I've been exploring California history as far as the 19th or 18th and 19th centuries. And to that end, I've tracked down each of the missions and the Asistencias, those are spin-off missions, and the presidios, the fortifications, which were designed to protect the missions. I also explored Russian California, and during my research on missions, I ended up discovering that a number of outlaws hung out around a particular saloon that was attached to Mission San Miguel, and that intrigued me. That got me wondering whether these outlaws crossed paths or not, and what about the lawmen that were pursuing them? And so that's what I've been researching. Well, I've been following certain California Bandidos for a while, and it's interesting to watch the crossover between the gangs. Right now, what I'm doing, because I have too much stuff from the video I was working on, I'm chasing down the Jack Powers Pio Linares gang, which haunted the San Luis Obispo area. And okay, this is going to be round 2. I hope you stick with me on my journey. I'm at the Dana Adobe in Nipomo, which was actually the center of Rancho, Nipomo. The reason I'm here is the Jack Powers Pio Linares gang decided they would rob this place. They had heard that the Dana family had sold like 300 head of cattle, and hey, this is a good opportunity. It's only about 23 miles away from San Luis Obispo. And what ended up happening is, apparently on the night of the attack, an Indian had stopped by, a native Californian had stopped by, and he had asked for shelter, and he was given shelter in one of the storage sheds. Well, now the gang shows up, and the Indian hears a noise, looks out or opens up the door, looks out the door, and someone tries to grab him, and they're unsuccessful. He runs away. Well, now the family hears about the disturbance. They hear this noise going on, and now they're ready. And the Powers gang, what they're doing is of course, now they understand that there's ammunition stored in a room on the south side of the Adobe, and they're watching that room very intently. They figure, hey, no one's showing up. No one's going into that room. Uh-oh, they must have a lot of ammunition already. They're ready for us. And so the gang gets out of town. So they never actually accomplish anything here, which is kind of awkward. But this sort of gives you an idea just how far the criminal activity is spreading as far as the gang. In 1856, Jack Powers helps hide the politician Ned McGowan from a posse sent by the San Francisco Vigilance Committee. Okay, McGowan gets away. But McGowan decides to write a book about his adventures and explains in detail how Powers managed to outwit the Vigilance Committee, which earned him the hatred of this group. It also earned him the nickname to be added in front of his name for the rest of his life, the Notorious Jack Powers. And This, of course, was throwing fuel on the fire. That led to the Los Angeles Vigilance Committee accusing him of masterminding a burglary gang in Los Angeles that was making them nuts. And the thing is, Powers did like to go to Los Angeles because he liked to gamble down there, and he also liked to race horses. So he was supposed to be arrested, and he was, by the Santa Barbara sheriff. Powers got out, fled extradition. He's trying to hide out, or at least he's just not going to go to LA. And this finally ends up going to the Supreme Court of California, and they tell him, no, Jack, you got to go to LA. And he does, but by that point, there's not enough evidence, so the case is dropped. The killings and disappearances continued. At one point, a couple of Monterey County officials were headed down to San Luis Obispo, and at the Nacimiento, what was later christened the Dark and Bloody Ground, they were found. It took them a while, but folks in San Luis Obispo started to figure out that, hey, there might be some bad people living in our community. Well, Pio Linares, he lived over on, I guess, Andrews and San Luis Drive. You know, so, yeah. Two Basques from France, a man named Barote and his partner Borel, founded Rancho San Juan Capistrano del Camote in the northeastern part of San Luis Obispo County, about 45 miles from San Luis Obispo itself. And in May of 1858, shortly after they'd settled into the rancho, 8 men visited and asked for shelter for the night. And those 8 men thanked them, and they left the next morning, and then they came back. It turned out that the 8 men were part of the Powers Leonis gang. As a matter of fact, Leonis was there. And what they ended up doing was they killed Burrell, threatened the other man, threatened his wife, and when the money was produced, about $2,700 worth, both men were dead. And the wife was taken hostage. The original plan, according to what people said that Leonardus wanted, was he wanted the 2 servants murdered and their bodies hidden, and no one would suspect anything else other than the servants must have done it. You know, the butler did it type thing. Well, what ended up happening is Leonardus didn't stay to see that everything was carried out. He just trusted his subordinates, and he left. He went back to San Luis Obispo. In the meantime, a couple of his other gang members ended up murdering a nearby hunter named Gilkey because they purchased some meat from him and realized, hey, we don't want this guy talking about we were in the area. So he has to die too. And what ended up happening as far as the California servants of the Basques is they were not killed. The 2 gang members who were supposed to take care of that decided, we're just gonna let them go. And what ended up happening is now the servants hot-footed it over to Captain Malag's place, the Rancho, and told the tale. He took that servant down to San Luis Obispo, where they identified one of the perpetrators. This was unusual. This time there were survivors. that meant that there were living witnesses who would be able to identify people. And with the aid of one of the survivors, one of the gang members was identified. He was arrested, he was jailed, later he was lynched. But now Walter Murray, an Englishman who had served in the same regiment as Powers, an attorney, he ended up forming, or helped to form, the 1858 Committee of Vigilance for San Luis Obispo, which would ultimately lead to the demise of the gang. By the way, this building, it's not the original burned down, but there is some of the adobe left. This building is where Murray had his office, and also where he published a newspaper, which is still being published today. Sheriff Castro's search intensified, and he came to this quiet neighborhood, and one of the existing buildings here, that was the home of Pio Linares, where he lived with his wife. Castro ordered that the roof be set ablaze in order to smoke Linares out. Linares fled under a hail of bullets, but now he and Jack Powers were exposed as members of this vicious gang, and Powers was exposed as the leader. I'm standing on Monterey with Broad Street over there. There's a reason why I'm showing you this very modern setting. The trees back there, those might not be the original trees, but those are the trees where people were getting lynched by vigilantes. And part of the reason I'm showing you this is because when Powers ended up hearing that vigilantes and Sheriff Castro were in search of Pio Linares and some of the other gang, Powers decided he wasn't going to hang out. He also heard that there were members of a vigilante posse coming up from Los Angeles, and what they had ended up doing is they ended up lynching a couple of people near Mission San Buenaventura. And the reason they got lynched is they were thought to be members of the Flores Daniel gang, who had just killed Sheriff Barton in Los Angeles. Well, in what is going to become Orange County. So he wanted no part of that. So things are really falling apart for the Jack Powers, Pio Linares gang. All right, so Powers is already taking off, and while Powers is taking off, Joaquin Valenzuela, who's really Jesus Valenzuela, gets caught. He confesses to some other crimes, but then he names a whole bunch of people as his Confederates, maybe in an attempt to save himself. Doesn't matter, he gets lynched. And now 10 posse members ride towards Mission La Purísima because they hear that Linares and company are down there. No, it's a fake out. It turns out that Linares and his people ended up heading into the Los Osos Valley. He's essentially coming home to where his story started. And he was supposed to have been hiding out with members of his gang, and they approached a shepherd to buy some food, and word got out, and by June 10th, the posse, led by Captain Malag, had surrounded a thicket near the Wilson Adobe, which actually used to be the Linares Adobe. And they're running Linares to ground. And some people will say, hey, he did this all as a deception, trying to throw people off his trail. I think Linares knew the end was coming and was coming home to die where his story started. Anyway, the outlaws are in a thicket. The thicket is too tough for the 30 members of the posse to ride through with horses. And so what they ended up doing is they settled down, they picketed it or around it. 15 guys tried to go in, and that was a fail. The posse tried to set fire to the willow thicket and to drive the bandits out. That was unsuccessful. And this goes on for something like 2 or 3 days, till finally Captain Malog ends up leading the posse in. They crawled through the thicket, and gunfire erupts within about 15 minutes. Linares is killed, some are captured. Hey, guess what happened to those guys? And that's going to be the end of Pio Linares' part of the story. So what became of the notorious Jack Powers? Well, unlike Linares, who got shot, Powers basically made it out of the area, went to Los Angeles and went on to Mexico. And reporters, of course, followed him to, give or to tell his story, because apparently he was big news. And he had vowed by the end of 1858 that he would return and he would face his accusers. The next year, another reporter had written that the notorious Jack Powers had a fine hotel in Mexico and that he was still planning to return to face his accusers. Then came a news article in the Daily Alta California in 1860 reporting that the notorious Jack Powers had purchased a ranch outside of Tubac in Arizona, and he was murdered by his vaqueros, who fed his body to some wild swine. So there's the end of the Powers Linares gang. I think next up I'm going to be switching over to Southern California and chasing down some bandidos over there, Juan Flores and Pancho Daniel. I hope you stick with me on my journey.